Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. Don't waste hours trying to find the best buy list price for your cards online. Simply send them to Card Conduit and let them take care of the rest. I have used Card Conduit multiple times already. I always use them to get the best value for my extra cards. I get fair prices for my cards and they save me tons of time. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. They give you the best price for your cards. They work with competitive buy listing partners, including ones not open to the public. Users get an average of 19% more for their collection than they would from any major retail buy list, even with Card Conduit's fees. Card Conduit also optimizes buy listing for card condition as well. Since vendors have different penalties for wear and tear, Card Conduit will find the best buy list priced against the specific condition of the card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Playing with Power member Alana, piloting the partner pair of Rograkh, Son of Rograkh, and Silas Wren, Seeker Adept. This deck seeks to resolve a card advantage engine like Ad Nauseam or Rhystic Study, draw a bunch of cards, and then win with Thassa's Oracle or Underworld Breach. Alana's opening hand contains a Misty Rainforest, Calling the Weak, Lotus Petal, Rhystic Study, and her London Mulligans are Underworld Breach, Chrome Mox, and Mox Opal. Next, we have our Mox Pearl patron Matt, piloting the partner pair of Krark the Thumbless and Thrasios Triton Hero. This deck seeks to copy spells using its commander's ability and leverages that value to execute a game-winning combo. Matt's opening hand contains a Volcanic Island, Veil of Summer, Mana Crypt, Essence Flux, Veyran Voice of Duality, Flooded Strand, and a Jeweled Lotus. After that, we have Playing with Power member Zach, piloting the partner pair of Tana the Bloodsower and Ardenn Intrepid Archaeologist. This deck seeks to slow down the game with stacks, cheat equip costs of equipment through its commander, and eventually win through combat. Zach's opening hand contains a Skull Clamp, Mana Crypt, Wild Growth, Ragavan Nimble Pilfer, Arbor Elf, Savannah, and a Plateau. Finally, we have our Mox Pearl patron John, piloting Aragorn the Uniter. This is a mid-range deck that seeks to generate infinite mana with Food Chain and burn out the table with its commander. John's opening hand contains a Noble Hierarch, Mox Diamond, Abundant Growth, Underworld Breach, Mana Crypt, Misty Rainforest, and a Tarnished Citadel. Without further ado, let's kick off his thick therapeutic theological thirst. Alana won the game of first move, last move, and gets to start us off. Alana draws a card for turn and plays a Misty Rainforest. She cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. She casts her commander, Rograkh, Son of Rograkh. She casts a Lotus Petal. She casts Calling the Weak, sacrificing Rograkh as an additional cost, adding 4 black. She casts Rhystic Study. She recasts her commander, Rograkh. She casts Paradise Mantle. With an explosive turn 1 and a completely empty hand, Alana passes the turn. Matt draws and plays a Flooded Strand. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts a Jeweled Lotus. Rhystic triggers and Alana draws. He cracks his Lotus to help cast his commander, Krark the Thumbless, and Alana draws again. He casts Nature's Claim, targeting Rhystic Study. Krark and Rhystic both trigger. Alana draws, then he wins his Krark roll, copying Nature's Claim, targeting Paradise Mantle. Both are destroyed, and Alana gains 8 life. Finished up, Matt passes to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Plateau. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. He casts Skull Clamp. Zach ends this turn. John draws and plays a Tarnished Citadel. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Misty Rainforest. He casts Abundant Growth. It enters, and John draws a card. He casts Noble Hierarch. John ships the turn. Alana draws and plays an Ottawara, Soaring City. She casts Grim Monolith and gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Veyran, Voice of Duality. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Krark. Alana takes it, and Matt passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks John with Ragavan. John takes it, Ragavan triggers, Zach creates a treasure, and John exiles a Lotus Petal off of the top of his library. In his second main phase, Zach plays a Savannah. He casts Yasharn, Implacable Earth. In response, Matt pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival, targeting Nature's Claim in his graveyard. Krark triggers twice through Veyran. Matt wins the flip, copying it, also targeting Nature's Claim. He loses his second flip, returning Noxious Revival to his hand. He pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival again, targeting Misty Rainforest in John's graveyard. Krark triggers twice, he loses the first flip, returning Noxious Revival to his hand, and then loses his second flip. He pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival again, targeting Misty Rainforest. Krark triggers twice, he loses his first flip, returning Noxious to his hand, and then wins his second flip, copying Noxious, putting Misty Rainforest onto the top of John's library. He pays 2 life to cast Noxious Revival again, targeting Misty Rainforest in Alana's graveyard. Krark triggers twice, he loses his first flip, returning Noxious to his hand, and then wins his second flip, copying Noxious. Then Alana puts Misty Rainforest onto the top of her library. Then Yasharn enters, and Zach fetches up a Plains and a Forest into his hand. He casts Lotus Petal from exile through Ragavan. Finished up, Zach passes to John. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Plateau. He casts his commander, Aragorn the Uniter. John ends his turn. Alana draws, plays a Misty Rainforest, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Nature's Claim, targeting Zach's Mana Crypt. Veyron gets +2/+2, and Krark triggers twice. He loses his first flip, returning Nature's Claim to his hand, and then loses his second flip. Matt ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Forest. He moves to combat and attacks Alana with Ragavan. Alana takes it, Ragavan triggers, Zach creates a treasure, and Alana exiles Mnemonic Betrayal. In his second main phase, Zach casts Wild Growth. He casts Wandering Archaic. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He casts Displacer Kitten. Aragorn triggers and John scries too. He moves to combat and attacks Matt with Aragorn. Noble Hierarch's Exalted triggers and Aragorn gets +1/+1. In response, Matt casts Essence Flux, targeting Krark. Veyron triggers twice, Krark triggers twice, and Wandering Archaic triggers. In response, John hard casts Mental Misstep, targeting Essence Flux. Displacer Kitten, Aragorn, and Wandering Archaic triggers. Zach copies Mental Misstep, targeting Essence Flux. Essence Flux is countered, then John scries 2, then Displacer Kitten flickers Abundant Growth. It enters and John draws a card. Then Mental Misstep fizzles, and then Matt pays for Wandering Archaic. He then wins his Krark flip, copying Essence Flux, targeting Krark. Veyron triggers twice and gets +2/+2. Then Krark flickers. He wins a second Krark flip, copying Essence Flux, targeting Krark again. Veyron triggers and gets an additional +2/+2. Then Krark flickers again. Matt blocks Aragorn with his 8/8 Veyron. Aragorn dies, and then John passes the turn. Alana draws, takes no actions, and passes to Matt. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts his commander, Thrasios Triton Hero. Matt ends his turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks John with Wandering Archaic and Alana with Ragavan. They both take it, Ragavan triggers, Zach creates a treasure, and Alana exiles a Polluted Delta. In his second main phase, he casts Kenrith's Transformation, targeting Krark. It enters and Zach draws. He equips Skull Clamp to Ragavan, killing it and drawing 2 cards. He plays a Plains for turn. He casts Juranith Magistrate. He casts Mother of Runes. He casts an Arbor Elf. With nothing else, Zach ships the turn to John. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Wandering Archaic. John passes the turn. Alana draws and casts Mox Opal. She passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts Finehorn Elves. He equips Skull Clamp to Finehorn Elves, killing it and drawing 2 cards. He equips Skull Clamp to Yasharn. He casts Stony Silence. In response, Matt activates Thrasios, scrying 1 and revealing a Cavern of Souls onto the battlefield tapped, naming Wizard as it enters. Stony Silence resolves and Zach moves to combat. He attacks John with Yasharn. John takes 5 and Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws, takes no actions, and passes. Alana draws and passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and passes as well. During his upkeep, Zach wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts his commander, Ardenn, Intrepid Archaeologist. He activates Arbor Elf, untapping Savannah. He moves to combat and Ardenn triggers, and in response, Matt casts Nature's Claim, targeting Skull Clamp. 2 Veyrons trigger and 2 Wandering Archaics trigger. John copies Nature's Claim, targeting Wild Growth. Wild Growth is destroyed and Zach gains 4 life. Then Zach copies Nature's Claim, targeting Alana's Grim Monolith. Monolith is destroyed and Alana gains 4 life. Then Veyron gets +2/+2, and then the original Nature's Claim resolves. Zach's Skull Clamp is destroyed and Zach gains 4 life. Zach attacks Alana with Yasharn and Wandering Archaic. Alana takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach plays a Windswept Heath. He passes. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and passes the turn. Alana draws, plays an Arid Mesa, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and passes to Zach. During his upkeep, Zach loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Ardenn and attacks Matt with Yasharn and Wandering Archaic. They both take it, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Rest in Peace. In response, Matt hard casts Noxious Revival, targeting Nature's Claim in his graveyard. 2 Wandering Archaics trigger, John ignores his trigger, and then Zach copies it, putting Skull Clamp onto the top of his library. Then Matt puts Nature's Claim onto the top of his library. Then Rest in Peace resolves and exiles all graveyards. Zach passes. At the end of Zach's turn, John channels Beseju, who endures, targeting Rest in Peace. Rest in Peace is destroyed, and then Zach fetches up a Temple Garden onto the battlefield tapped. The turn moves to John. During his upkeep, John wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and plays a command tower. He hardcasts Elvish Spirit Guide. Everyone realizes that they are at that point in the game, and then John passes the turn. Alana draws, takes no actions, and passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Nature's Claim, targeting Stony Silence. Veyron triggers twice, and 2 Wandering Archaics trigger. John copies it, targeting Zach's mana crypt. Crypt is destroyed, and Zach gains 4 life. Then Zach copies it, targeting John's Abundant Growth. It is destroyed, and John gains 4 life. Then Veyron gets +2/+2, and then Stony Silence is destroyed, with Zach gaining 4 life. Matt passes. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Ardenn and Matt with Yasharn and Wandering Archaic. Matt blocks Archaic with his Elk and Thrasios. Before blocks, Matt activates Thrasios. In response, Zach casts a Braid targeting Thrasios. Wandering Archaic triggers and Zach pays. Then Thrasios dies, then Matt scries 1, revealing a Guy's Cradle onto the battlefield tapped. Then Alana takes it, and Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, John wins his mana crypt roll. He draws and casts Savine's Reclamation, targeting Abundant Growth at his graveyard. Displacer Kitten and a Wandering Archaic trigger. John pays for Archaic, then flickers his mana crypt. Then John returns Abundant Growth from his graveyard to the battlefield. It enters, and John draws a card. He casts Arcane Signet, flickering Abundant Growth with Displacer Kitten, drawing when it enters. He casts Esper Sentinel. John ships the turn to Alana. Alana draws and passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his mana crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Mox Amber. Esper triggers and Matt pays. Matt passes the turn to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Matt with Ardenn, Yasharn, and Wandering Archaic. In response, Matt casts Chain of Vapor, targeting Wandering Archaic. 2 Veyrens, 2 Wandering Archaics, and Esper Sentinel all trigger. John draws, then John copies the Chain of Vapor, targeting Mother of Runes. In response, Zach activates Mother of Runes, targeting Wandering Archaic. In response, Alana casts a Chain of Vapor of her own, targeting Yasharn. 2 Wandering Archaics and Esper trigger. John draws, John copies the chain, targeting Drannith Magistrate. Drannith bounces, Zach's Wandering Archaic trigger resolves, Zach copies the chain, targeting John's Wandering Archaic. Phantasmal Image triggers, and John sacrifices it. Then Alana's Chain of Vapor resolves, and Yasharn bounces back to Zach's hand. Zach continues the chain, sacrificing a land, targeting Veyron. In response, Matt casts Veil of Summer. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Matt pays. Veil resolves, and Matt draws. Then the copy of chain fizzles. Mother of Rune's ability resolves, and Zach gives Wandering Archaic protection from blue. Then Matt pays for Archaic, then Veyron gets +2/+2. Then Matt blocks Ardenn with Veyron, and takes the rest, and Ardenn dies. In his second main phase, Zach cracks his Windswept Teeth and pays a life. In response, Alana cracks her Arid Mesa and Misty Rainforest, paying 2 life, fetching up a Badlands onto the battlefield, and fetching up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Then Zach fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He recasts Drannith Magistrate. In response, John cracks his Misty Rainforest, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. Then Drannith resolves, and Zach casts Eternal Witness. It enters, and Zach returns Stony Silence from his graveyard to his hand. He casts Stony Silence. Esper triggers, and in response, John casts Eladamri's Call. Displacer Kitten and Wandering Archaic trigger. Zach copies it, and in response, Alana casts Born Upon a Wind. Wandering Archaic triggers, and Zach copies it. It resolves, and Zach draws. Then Alana's resolves, and she draws. Then Zach fetches up a Dockside Extortionist into his hand. Still in response, Zach flashes in a Dockside Extortionist through Born Upon a Wind. It enters, and Zach creates 8 treasures. Still in response, Zach flashes in a Yasharn. Yasharn enters, and Zach fetches up a Plains and a Forest into his hand. Then Displacer Kitten flickers Mana Crypt, and then Eladamri's Call resolves. John fetches up a Grand Abolisher into his hand. Then John draws from Esper, and Stony Silence resolves. Next, Zach plays a Forest Return. He casts Finale of Devastation where X equals 3. Zach fetches up an Archon of Emeria onto the battlefield. All finished up, Zach passes to John. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard onto the battlefield tapped through Archon of Emeria. John passes. Alana draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Alana creates 8 treasures. Alana passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll, takes 3 damage, and dies. The turn moves to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Archon, Yasharn, and Archaic. Alana takes it all, and in his second main phase, Zach plays a Plains. He recasts Mother of Runes and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, John flashes in an Archivist of Ogma. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Grand Abolisher. John ends his turn. Alana draws and casts Praetor's Grasp, targeting John. Wandering Archaic and Esper trigger, John draws, then Zach copies Grasp, also targeting John. They both fetch up cards from John's library into exile face down. Alana passes. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Alana with Archon, Yasharn, and Wandering Archaic. Alana takes it, and in his second main phase, Zach casts Stoneforge Mystic. It enters, and Zach fetches up a Colossus Hammer into his hand. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and John gains a life and draws a card. Zach plays a Gemstone Caverns and passes the turn. During his upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays an Arid Mesa into play tapped. He casts Delighted Halfling. John ships the turn. Alana draws and casts Ragavan Nimble Pilferer. She passes. Zach draws and recasts his commander, Ardenn. He plays an exotic orchard for turn. He activates Stoneforge Mystic, putting Colossus Hammer onto the battlefield. He moves to combat and Ardenn triggers. Zach moves Colossus Hammer onto Wandering Archaic. He attacks Alonda with Wandering Archaic and John with Yasharn. Before blocks, Zach activates Mother of Runes, giving Wandering Archaic protection from red until the end of turn. They both take it, and Alana dies. Zach passes the turn. During its upkeep, John wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and casts the One Ring. It enters, and John gains protection from everything. John ends his turn. Zach draws and casts Eladamri's Call, paying for Esper. In response, John hardcasts Fierce Guardianship, Displacer Kitten, and a Wandering Archaic trigger. John unfortunately forgot. Zach copies Fierce, countering Fierce. Then Displacer Kitten flickers Abundant Growth, and John draws a card. Then Zach fetches up an Elish Norn Grand Cenobite into his hand. Archivist of Ogma triggers, and John gains a life and draws a card. Zach passes. During his upkeep, John loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays a Steam Prince, into play tapped. He casts an overloaded Cyclonic Rift, Displacer Kitten, and Wandering Archaic trigger. Zach copies Rift, bouncing all of John's non-land permanents. Then Kitten fizzles, and then all of Zach's non-land permanents are bounced. He cracks his Arid Mesa, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts a Mox Diamond, discarding Gemstone Mine. He exiles Elvish Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a green. He recasts the One Ring. It enters, and John gains protection from everything. He activates the One Ring, adding a burning counter and drawing a card. Finished up, John passes, discarding to hand size. Zach draws and casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Zach creates 3 treasures. He casts Drannith Magistrate. He casts Stony Silence. He casts Ardenn. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, John loses a life to the One Ring. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Underworld Breach. He casts Swords to Plowshares, targeting Drannith Magistrate. In response, Zach casts what he exiled with Praetor's Grasp, Silence. Silence resolves, then Swords resolves, Drannith is exiled, and Zach gains a life. Unfortunately locked out, John passes, sacrificing Underworld Breach. Zach draws and casts Colossus Hammer. He moves to combat and Ardenn triggers. Zach moves Colossus Hammer onto Dockside. He attacks John with Ardenn and Dockside. John takes it all and goes to 1 life. In his second main phase, Zach casts Archon of Emeria. Zach passes the turn. During his upkeep, John's Mana Crypt and One Ring both trigger. In response, John casts Angel's Grace. He loses the life to the One Ring, but still goes to 1. He also wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and passes back to Zach. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks John with everything. John takes it all, dies, and Zach wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a wild match tonight. Congrats to Zach on his hard-fought victory. Many say that Stax is dead, but Zach proved tonight that it is alive and well. Even with a turbo deck and 3 blue decks against him, Zach was able to shut down the board, nerf everyone's resources, and close out the game. The most valuable card in tonight's game, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Yasharn, Implacable Earth. It was super hard to decide tonight's card. We considered Wandering Archaic, Stony Silence, and even Archon of Emeria. It was this card, however, that completely shifted the pace of the game. No one could sacrifice treasures, crack fetches, or even cast ritual spells like Calling the Weak. Once it resolved, Zach had a chokehold over the game. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.